Now, moving along, I have the privilege to introduce our CEO and President, Sumedh Thakar, who is going to take us through the Qualys and all things around our vision. So, Sumedh, over to you.
Which of these monsters is the one that I have to use? There's like two of those. This one? Okay, all right. Thank you, Matt. Sorry, I was waiting. I thought you were going to say more stuff. Well, welcome, everybody. It's good to see all of you here. People are here not just from UK, but also Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Middle East. So we want to welcome all of you. It is my stated goal to be on time today, though path to success is always little with a lot of failures, and I suspect today is going to be one of those. I do think that, however, if you just hand over the PO to Matt on the way out, we can all take the 1026 Elizabeth line and go home. I don't think that's going to happen either. Great talk by the professor, as I will say. I do want to take a moment, if all of you would give a big round of applause to not just the professor, but also NCSC for all the amazing work that they have done to protect UK businesses. Would appreciate that. It can be a lonely world out there in cyber, and having an agency like that actually provides you guidance and parameters in which you can work around is super helpful. I did think that one of the things that was super important that he talked about was, at the end of the day, it is what is the impact to you from a cyber attack is the thing that matters the most. There are many different ways that you can be impacted, and at most of the time, what you are going to lose is really what bothers you the most. And so today, I wanted to talk a little bit about, how many of you know what ASM is? Attack Surface Management. So we're going to talk about, in today's world where the attacks are accelerating in many ways, the threats actually are the same, but the attacks actually continue to accelerate. How do we take a different approach to the way we are working in cybersecurity, and how do we anchor what our focus and outcome is as cybersecurity professionals to what really matters? And at the end of the day, whatever the loss is what matters the most. And we just had an example this morning. One of our employees, product managers, he flew in from the US and yesterday, and he landed, and he got a call from the bank, said that his credit cards are blocked because of fraud, and so he cannot use his cards anymore here. And apparently he also had his credit card linked to his bank account, so the money from the bank account is gone as well. So my first question was, how did it happen? And he said, it doesn't matter, I'm poor right now. So the impact for him, so of course we care about our employees, so we're gonna pass out a hat. So if you don't mind putting £1 in the hat, we would be happy to help him. Now, for the sake of privacy of the employee, I cannot give out his name, but he will be talking about Total Cloud later today. I use that as an example because what really matters to us is not necessarily what is attackable, which is what we focus on attack surface management a lot. You might have 100 different ways that an attack can come, but you have to anchor really what is the outcome or the impact to you with what is at risk. And so while the industry is very focused on attack surface management, the concept of anchoring what you're trying to do in cybersecurity to the actual risk of what you're going to lose is what matters the most. What would you lose, and what is the probability of that happening? And that's really what we wanted to talk a little bit about today, is that no matter amount of money that you're spending in cyber, it feels like not enough, because no matter how many vulnerabilities you fix, you still find more and more things, and getting to the point where you just cannot keep doing the same approach anymore. So how do we pivot to anchoring ourselves on what is risk and risk management? And I say that because, a lot of times we talk about cybersecurity, and I ask people, what is cybersecurity to them? And so we get all these responses that, okay, we have to prevent every breach, we have to stop attackers, we have to fix every vulnerability, we have to apply every patch, and then of course you have the acronym soup, the ZTNA, CIEM, CSPM, CPAP. Oh, that's the breathing thing, never mind. But at the end of the day, we forget that cybersecurity to a business is a risk management exercise, right? What we're trying to do is to manage the risk to the digital infrastructure. And when you have the conversation of risk, the first question that comes up is, how do you define risk? And instead of going to Wikipedia, I picked up this quote from Rich Sierson, who wrote this book about how to measure anything in cybersecurity. How many of you have read this book? We have a few people here. So Rich, who's the author, he is here. I highly recommend you buy his book because I get 10 cents of every purchase that he's great. He's sitting right next to me. I asked him if he had any advice for me before I go for the keynote. He said, don't suck and don't die. I think he explains risk management in a very simple way, which is the mitigation and transfer of the most plausible scenario for loss to the business. I think there's a third element to that also, which is unstated here, which is risk acceptance. So when you talk about risk, the three components of risk management really are risk mitigation, risk acceptance, how much are you willing to accept, risk mitigation is what is the proactive measures you're going to take to reduce the possibility of something happening. Second is risk acceptance. Like with everything we do in life, we accept a certain amount of risk. You cannot just go and have zero risk. So when you talk about risk management, there are the three components that everybody looks at, which is how much do I focus on mitigation, how much do I focus on accepting, and then whatever I cannot mitigate and I cannot accept, how do I transfer that risk? And so risk management is about that mitigation and transfer, because there is a certain amount of risk that you're inherently going to accept. And what is interesting, and you see that with Marks and Spencer, what is happening is that your resilience is a super important part of your risk, feeling of risk and your risk acceptance. So if you are very sure that you are going to be able to bring your systems back up in 4 hours, your appetite for risk is a lot more. You're less worried because you're like, yeah, I know we have tested this 10 times, we can come back up, and which means I'm willing to accept a larger amount of potential of an attack happening, because I know that while we are going to do a certain amount of effort in mitigating the attack and transferring, we also can recover pretty quickly, so we don't feel that the impact of that is going to be so much. So when we talk about risk management, is really about what are the ways that we can manage, mitigate that risk and transfer that risk. So the reality is that we will never have zero risk. So no matter what you say that I have fixed everything, every particular vulnerability, everything, there is always an amount of unknown risk. And so any time that you're driving towards a zero risk, at some point, you are really not getting any ROI on the spend that you're doing, because now the long tail of the issues that you're trying to fix is costing you a significant amount of money, but not necessarily reducing your risk. And so zero risk and trying to chase that is actually not a financially sound decision. Now, the problem is that the moment you talk about risk, the question becomes how much. That's the only question. When anybody says risk, there is a risk of something happening, your first question is how much risk? And most people in cybersecurity working on that cannot articulate what is the financial loss to their business if there is a cyber attack. And literally everybody sitting in this room, what they are doing is risk management. Whatever you do in cybersecurity is all about managing that risk. And how many of you have the word risk in your title? Like nobody. Well, except you, right? I made up a title for him, so it's fine. He's our Chief Risk Technology Officer, something like that. So that tells you the mindset of enterprises is that we are here, I am the vulnerability guy, or I am the patching gal. What our focus is like, I gotta fix all the vulnerability, I gotta patch. We're not thinking, how are we a part of risk management? And to know that everyone needs to really understand what is the outcome impact of that attack, and what is the financial loss that you're going to have when you have a potential attack, right? Of course, there are certain scenarios where it's not necessarily financial loss. Majority of us here are really looking at a financial loss that can happen. So the next question then becomes, if I kind of know how much is my risk, which we all really need to know, which 99% of us don't, then what do we need to do to reduce that likelihood of that particular attack happening? And risk management is all about figuring out the most efficient way to reduce the likelihood of a major financial loss. So maybe patching is needed. Maybe you have another way to mitigate the risk. Patching is not the only thing. So what is the most cost-effective way that you can, as an example, create an operationally safe way to mitigate a security risk? Can we have reduced security risk while reducing operational risk as well? That's always the battle. So risk management is about reducing the likelihood of any major financial loss to the business. But at the end of the day, if you really don't know how much is the loss, how do you know how much to spend on reducing that loss? Right? If you have a car that is 20,000 pounds, and then you're spending 30,000 pounds to protect that car, you should probably just not drive anymore. But how do you know what you're spending in cyber? Is that enough, or is that too much? If you don't really know what is that you're trying to protect. So it is super important that we really anchor ourselves on what are we trying to protect and what kind of loss are we trying to protect, which is the concept of value at risk. If you have a 500 million pound a year business, that's the intrinsic value of that business, let's say. That does not mean that is your value at risk. Your value at risk is if there is a ransomware attack or if there is a data breach, what is the potential amount of loss that I could have on a daily basis for how many days? Would I say if I get a ransomware attack, I can lose up to 10 million pounds a day for 7 days? That's my overall equation, ballpark. Nobody knows that 100%, but that is your value at risk. So at the end of the day, before you make any investment in cybersecurity, to buy any tool, any people, any process, the most important thing that you really need to know is what is your value at risk that you're trying to protect, because value at risk is what decides how much you are spending. And 99% of the folks we talk to, they say they don't know, even CISOs. In fact, we were talking to a CISO a couple of weeks ago, and we showed them financial information about their business and some calculation of potential loss, and they were like, well, how did you get all this internal information that you were not supposed to have access to? And we pointed out that all of this was publicly available in the filings that the company was doing, but the security team never even looks at those public filings and what the business is and how much it is making and what is the potential for loss. So figuring out your value at risk is about how do you bring all of your key stakeholders together to define what is our business, how much is it making annually, what is the potential loss scenarios, what loss scenarios really matter. I think reputational damage, like nobody wants to be in the news, obviously, but reputational damage, for the most part in 2025, is not something that businesses feel it causes a long-term impact to them. And we have seen this repeatedly, that because there is a breach and your name was in the newspaper, it does not necessarily affect business for a very long time. And the reason I ask is because how many of you in the last 1 year changed your provider because they send you a notification that they might have had a breach and your data might have been lost? Not like one person. So everybody else, We're like, oh, that sucks, but then we're still gonna go buy. We're all waiting for Marks and Spencer website to come back so we can buy more. So you have to understand for your business, is reputational damage going to be a significant factor? I mean, Marks and Spencer stock, by the way, is up still over the last 6 months. So what is the financial damage that can happen from reputational loss? What is the damage that can happen if some data is stolen and it's a dark web? There's a fairly well-known playbook for that. You hire Mandiant, or you have a PR company and they're doing it on the side, but the business is continuing. For the most part, if you talk to the key stakeholders, their biggest concern is any time that your ability to conduct business is impacted is the biggest concern for them. If your website is down for 7 days, if you're not able to conduct transactions for a long period of time, this is what really bothers most people, and this is where people want to be able to put some values on what are the 3 or 4 key scenarios of loss, and how do you put some numbers around that, because that decides how you anchor around what your spend is. So for that to happen, everybody in the business needs to speak the same language when you talk about risk. So most of the time, if you ask the vulnerability folks, most of you are out here, if you ask them, hey, what's the risk? They will tell you a CVSS score, which means absolutely nothing to your CFO. If you try to tell your CFO why you need 10 million pounds to fix everything that is CVSS 9.8, it means absolutely nothing. ZTNA means nothing. That means nothing, because the business speaks in terms of dollar value. They speak in terms of money. Whereas people who are trying to fix things are looking at number of patches. And by the way, that is reflected in how security leaders have been reporting things to the board. So 5 years ago, there was a big movement for security leaders who wanted to be at the board. They wanted an opportunity to be in front of the board. And because cyber is so important, they wanted to give an update on cyber. And then they got a chance, and then they don't want to go back again, because the board did not understand anything that they were trying to say in all these vulnerabilities that they were patching and how many open buckets they had and stuff like that. And the board just wanted to know, oh, that's great. You spent 2 years and $2 million implementing MFA. Wonderful. Okay, so how much safer are we? Like 2 times, 5 times? Are we we reduce the potential of loss by $10 million? Like, what is the equation? And we said, no, it was a great project. Everybody worked hard. But it means nothing to the board. You're not speaking the same language. So how do we align ourselves to speaking the same language? And then the question is, what is the language of risk? And really, it is money for the most part, unless you're specifically in certain areas where it's not necessarily about the money. But 99% of you are running a business that is making, hopefully, or losing money with the future dream of making money, but it is all about the money. So the only language of risk, really, at the end of the day, is money. And so then the question is, how, as a person who's focused on vulnerabilities, do you translate a CVSS 8.5 to dollars? Otherwise, it really doesn't mean anything. As I said earlier, your value at risk really decides how much you want to spend. And so today, because you don't have a very good, most businesses don't have a very good idea of what their value at risk is, there is a back of the mind calculation where it's like 7 to 8% of your IT budget seems about right as how much you should spend on cybersecurity. And so there is no scientific basis for that. That's just kind of how people spend it. And it was okay up to a couple of years ago, but I'm sure a lot of you face this now. In the last 2 years, cyber budgets have increased only in single digits. Adjusted to inflation is like 5 or 6% maximum. The days of 20, 30% growth in cyber budget where FUD was driving additional spend have definitely gone, which means the open bar in cybersecurity is closed now. You have to first get a ticket for your drink from your CFO. And she doesn't care about CVSS base scores. So value at risk is important for you to be able to mitigate or transfer your risk. Now, the issue, as I said, the overall industry still speaks in terms of alerts and vulnerabilities and patches. And so when you present that to a board or you present that to the management or the CEO, whoever, how many vulnerabilities you found, how many vulnerabilities you fixed, what is it? It means that really nothing. It just doesn't mean anything to the business. So how do we start speaking the right language of risk and bridge that gap between the technical aspects of it and the business aspect of it? And no conversation on risk can be complete without the business context. So, if I tell somebody you have a CVSS 9.5 vulnerability and you have another vulnerability that is CVSS 7.5, which one will you fix first? Obviously, you'll fix the 9.5 first. Then if I tell you that the 9.5 is on an asset that is part of a business unit that makes 2 million a year versus the 7.5 is one that makes 500 million a year, immediately your priority is going to flip and change. So business context actually very profoundly impacts prioritization and how you think of risk management. Just having the technical part does not really give you the full big picture. So now that's the aspirational goal. How many of you know all the assets you have in your environment? All right, nobody. So let's start, let's come down to earth now. We don't even know how many assets we're running. So if we don't have that, how do we know, how many alerts are coming from those? Most of the breaches, you're always like, wait, I didn't know the asset was there. And then, of course, the security team is like, well, asset management is not my job. Patch management is not my job. But then if there is a breach from an asset that you did not know about or that IT did not patch about, who goes in front of the authorities? Is it the IT guy who they forgot to patch? Or is it still the CISO who has to be the one thinking of having to go to jail because somebody in IT did not patch that? So do we really have the full context of the assets? Do we have the full context of all our findings? Can we correlate them effectively, but not correlate just with each other, but correlate with a higher goal of putting dollar values or pound values or euro values on our businesses so that we can have a linear conversation around, well, what does this particular funding or vulnerability mean? And how do I bridge that gap to the operational impact of it versus the security impact of it? Now, we spent a lot of time in building amazing dashboards and taking selfies with it because it's somebody else's job to fix things. But like I said, from a business perspective, all of your spend in building those dashboards is of zero value if the issue was not fixed before an attacker got there. Because then you just spend all this money making things look pretty, but didn't actually fix things. So that was one of the things that 5 years ago at Qualys, we came up with this idea that, hey, if we see a vulnerability, why don't we just fix it? And a lot of these analyst firms that we all look up to told us that we were idiots and that nobody would ever do that because patching is something that is not the security team's job, it is the IT team's job. But as always, we decided to be crazy, and you will be shocked that in 2024, Qualys agents deployed 110 million patches in our customer environment just in 1 year. All purchased by the security teams trying to find ways to have an impact of all the work that they're doing and prioritizing things. So my point here is that any risk management exercise is of no value if you don't actually get things remediated before an attacker gets there. Now, if nobody knows, we're all good. We always find these vulnerabilities in sudo where it has been there for 10 years when the code was updated, but nobody knew, we're fine. It only becomes a problem when somebody knows about it. So the point is that when you know about it, how are we going to respond and remediate in a meaningful period of time and not get bogged down remediating things that are not important because we just don't know what we're focusing on and not aligning them with risk and the business that we have. So what is the current state of cybersecurity? If you ask somebody, hey, what is your view of your risk posture today? Most security leader will say, I have a top 10 dashboard from Sneak. I have a top 10 dashboard from Checkmarks. I have a top 10 dashboard from Wiz. I have a top 10 dashboard from Qualys, hopefully. But what does that mean to my retail banking risk of losing 50 million pounds a week? Nobody can explain that. And as our industry always likes to come up with new terms, so there is the ISPM now, there is CSPM, there is KSPM. So all we have is these SPMs, which is all BSPM, because it doesn't really tell you anything about what the state of security is. So how do we move from that sort of approach where we're just throwing data and not being able to figure out what that means to the business to a different approach, which is actually quite fundamental approach, because today we are all struggling with how many times are you giving things to your IT team saying this is all critical, you have to fix it. 10,000 things are critical because CVSS says so. And then you wonder why the IT team doesn't like the security team. Because you know what, after they complain and they fix those 10,000 things, you reward them with 10,000 more things. They're never a partner, because then at some point, if people just become immune to that, you're like, okay, well, every day you come, you're like, everything is critical. I have actually stuff to do that will make money for the business. But it is also upon us as security team to make sure we're not wasting our business's time. Despite the CVSS score, if that particular vulnerability is actually, or misconfiguration or identity is not going to really lead to any kind of a business loss, which is the risk surface management part that I talked about, you really should not push your IT and dev teams to spend time fixing that. Because if they are spending 10 hours a week fixing security issues that actually have no exploit, that are not or cannot be exploited in your environment, there is no path to get there, we're basically stealing from the business. We're stealing time away that they could be using for innovating and creating new things. So it is really upon us to make sure that we don't get into this thing of like where all we do is just take everything that's critical and dump it, and then every time they fix critical stuff, they're rewarded with more critical stuff. So we really need to move from, we're at some point, tools like Qualys, as we get better, the problem becomes worse for customers, right? The more things we find, the more things you're not fixing. It's not that you're actually fixing more things, you're actually fixing less things now as a percentage of how many things are found. So it's always funny because those of you who don't know, I've been at Qualys for 21 years. So I was one of the first engineers to write code on the scanner. And back in the day, 21 years ago, a gold standard customer would scan their entire environment once a quarter. And then they would hand over IT 90 days to fix all the findings, okay? And now we have customers, millions and millions of assets. We have customers that complain that our agents are scanning only every 4 hours. They're like, could it not go faster? I'm wondering, how fast are you fixing things? Okay, because if you're not fixing things, which most of them are struggling with, then it's like you weigh yourself 4 times a day without going to the gym. The outcome is going to be the same. So how do we move from this like pile of things that now come our way into something where we actually figure out what is a risk factor versus what is an indicator of exposure? Like, we've sort of moved very similarly on the post-breach detection side to find out indicators of compromise, similar concept of what is an indicator of exposure. How do we figure out of all the crap that is coming through all of the tools and the APIs and everything, which are the things that actually truly matter that are going to have a financial impact? Like first is, are they even gonna have an impact from a technical perspective? And then how does that lead to a financial impact? And how do you get those indicators of exposure? So otherwise, we're just playing risk whack-a-mole. The moment there is a new celebrity vulnerability, which is even a term that our industry came up with, apparently even vulnerabilities are celebrities these days. Whenever there's a Log4j or something like that, everybody is now dropping everything else and just fixing Log4j. when 99% of those had absolutely zero way to be exploited. I would say in our industry that was one of the biggest boondoggles, being forced by management wanting to make sure that you had zero log4j vulnerabilities, and we just spent so much time fixing things that actually had no possibility of any attack. And so because we don't have a structured approach to managing risk, we just end up playing a risk whack-a-mole, which is, oh, this new thing came out, like now everybody drop everything that they're doing and we go and we rush and we try to fix that. And it doesn't help these days with CEOs and board members getting all these feeds from Twitter, and then they call the CISO to say, is this in our environment? Do we have zero instances? And so we got to move from this risk whack-a-mole approach where we're just trying to see the next latest shiny thing that comes up and move into a more structured approach of how do we operationalize our risk management process. Now, the industry went through this a few years ago with the Security Operations Center. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, people were like trying to pull logs in and Excel sheets and trying to figure out if an attacker was in the environment. People tried to build security data lakes, but we moved towards a more structured approach for post-breach detection. If an attacker is in our environment, singular platform, process, people, where you're bringing log data from multiple different assets, multiple tools, you're applying threat intelligence, you're trying to really figure out correlating the different findings coming from different tools, applying threat intelligence, and then taking remediation action with orchestration, with SOAR, and a few other things. And so now, instead of explaining all of that, we're in a good place to go tell the board or the regulators that, yes, we have a SOC. When you say, yes, we have a SOC, the conversation shrinks pretty dramatically versus having to explain that entire process of how you're managing your ability to detect threats that are coming in the environment. So the SOC was born out of that necessity to triage those alerts. What about proactive risk management? Where is that similar concept where we have operationalized risk management in the same way that we have operationalized what I call as wartime, which is attacker is in my environment, I got to go find them, versus peacetime, which is how do I proactively look at all the stuff that is coming to me and making decisions on what actually is my risk surface, what is causing risk to me, and remediating that particular risk. So there is a severe need to operationalize our entire risk management process. Otherwise, we're just trying to do 10 different dashboards. You give the team, oh, I'm only giving you top 10, but from each of my 10 solutions is now top 100. Because you haven't really done that work of correlating to figure out what the actual risk is. And so that's why we introduced the concept of a ROC, which is a Risk Operations Center. Similar idea to a SOC, but more focused on being able to collect all of your assets, all of your findings, all of your data from multiple different sources, triaging them, applying threat intelligence, figuring out remediation orchestration, and tying it back to business values. Just because you have a highly exploitable vulnerability does not mean you have to drop everything and fix it because it's only on a business unit that is making $1 million a day. It's not the highest priority. Let's focus on fixing these two other things. And by the way, there is this narrative that people constantly keep saying about like, oh, the attackers have to be right only once. The life is not that easy. Any attack is never where they get into one system and everything is compromised. It is always a chain of things that have to happen. There is always a sequence of events. They have to get lucky many times also. And so anything where you can operationalize your risk management, whether you use MITRE, whether you use whatever other methodology to create obstacles in the way that can cause them to not be successful, is a win for us. So the idea of a risk operations center is, there are multiple components, but the number one is a unified asset inventory, which none of us have. But if you want to build a risk operations center, you will need to be able to know all your assets in one place. So you now have a good view of proactively what are you trying to do. Then you aggregate your risk factors from multiple different sources. Vulnerability management is one from Qualys, that's on the runtime. You could have vulnerability detection from source code. You could have identity, ISPM type findings, because identities could be bad. You have application findings from DAST, where you might have SQL injection, cross-site scripting type vulnerabilities, container vulnerabilities, cloud misconfigurations. How do all of those relate to my 20 million pound a year business? How do those findings relate to that? So aggregating all those risk factors from different tools, applying threat intelligence, super important, because majority of the findings have no real way of being attacked. Even if there is a POC, many times it is not a focus area for attackers. So how do you apply threat intelligence to know exactly what is important? So this is a technical aspect of it. Then you apply the business context. Just because your threat intelligence tells you that this is being exploited in the wild, it may not be a significant part. And all of you suffer from the side effect of this when you have the mafia of security scorecard and BitSight giving you all of these findings that you have to chase down without any business context, and you have to constantly keep telling them, oh no, it's my dev network, it's a system that doesn't matter to my business, yet they don't care. You have to spend a bunch of money to try to get that resolved just so because your board is watching your score. So that is what happens when you have lack of business context and you just look at the technical finding. Prioritization is important. We are definitely at the point where not a single one of us here is delusional enough to think we're going to fix all the vulnerabilities and misconfigurations that have been detected right now. We just don't have the resources, and it is actually not good business to spend a ton of money just to fix anything and everything. So prioritization is super key, to prioritize what matters to your business, and then actually at the end of the day getting it done is very important. And the last piece of a risk operations center needs to be very comprehensive reporting, because we all have auditors and we have management and we have board, and at the end of the day, whatever we do technically, the thing that gets us the money and the promotion is the report that we submit. So communication is super important. And so the Risk Operations Center, this is not a Qualys product or anything like that. It is the idea of what, as an industry, where we need to go to and stop emailing each other Excel sheets of CVEs, and then yelling at people and using threats of promotions and stuff like that to get people to waste time on fixing things that don't matter. Can we have a conversation that says, your risk of losing $10 million a day is high right now, and by the way, if you fix these 2 vulnerabilities, you will be the hero that brought down that risk by half. That's a much better conversation to have with your IT team than throwing a big list of CVEs and then complaining how they have not fixed all of that. So it's been really amazing to see the kind of feedback that we have gotten. And by the way, it's also a much more strategic conversation with your management. If your management asks you, what is your 2025 cybersecurity strategic vision, and you go and tell them that this year we are going to fix all severity 3 vulnerabilities, that's not a strategic conversation. But if you are able to say, today we are spending way too much time for your IT and dev teams fixing things that don't matter to the business, we would like to implement a risk operations center that allows us to operationalize our risk management exercise, pull all our findings, pull all our data, apply threat context, and stop giving IT teams things that are not important to the business so they can have more time to create value to the business. That is a much more of a strategic conversation to say we're going to implement a risk operations center in 2025, 2026, than saying this is the year we are going to enable CyberArk encryption on all of our laptops. That's a technical thing. That's not a strategic conversation. So our goal here is to really build that out. So we're excited to release what is our version of the Risk Operations Center, which is the world's first cloud-based ROC, which is we call as the Qualys Enterprise True-Risk Management Platform, which is really about, and hopefully all of you are familiar with TrueRisk, which has been great because everybody says, yes, that's the risk, but what is the true risk to my business? So it works really well. So the ETM solution that Mayuresh is going to talk about today will give you a preview of how Qualys has envisioned a risk operations center should be. And exciting for us is that outside and on the right, Marek, is we have set up a risk operations center which has all the different screens. that you can track different aspects of proactive risk management that our customers are using today. And there is a chair, and you can experience that. You can sit, you can see all the screens, you can monitor the different aspects of risk and get an experience of what it is to deploy and manage a risk operations center. The good news is that our risk operations center does not harm the operator, like in the case of that AI drone that killed the operator. Our ROC does not do that. So I wanted to give an example of this because it really highlights attack surface management to risk surface management. So this is a proof of concept 2 weeks ago we did with a company in the US that is a pharmaceutical company. No, actually they're a pharmacy company. And so we worked with them because they really were bought into the idea of a risk operations center. They wanted to show that management a win. So what we did was we ingested all of their findings that they had from Qualys. They had Wiz in the cloud, which was it was a gift that kept on giving them. We had CrowdStrike findings. They had security scorecard external findings. When we ingested all of those, it was 62.5 million findings that we ingested in 24 hours. These are the risk factors and your asset inventory. So we're able to get their entire asset inventory, all the risk factors together. Once we applied the Qualys threat intelligence out of the box, it reduced the exposure down to the things that were actually weaponized, that actually were associated with malware, that were actually being used by malware attackers. That was only 4% of the overall findings that were ingested actually had any meaningful threat intelligence that could be used for exploit. Then, when we applied the business context for them, which is look at all my assets that have high business value, all my assets that maybe are internet facing, that are databases configurable, but maybe PCI related, that number went down to 300,000. And so I told the CISO, if it cost them £1 to fix every vulnerability, I just saved them 62 million pounds to 300,000 pounds. So I'll be happy to take 5 million pounds in return. But he did not like that, but I'm just saying that it is effective way because you are getting pushed back by the IT teams constantly saying, you guys are giving me so much crap to fix all the time. Show them the rest of the crap that you're not giving them because you actually have a proper process in place to prioritize the things that truly matter, which is going to be a much better conversation than just, again, saying this is what the thing is. But more than the potential dollar saving, it is also that it gives back time to the business to do meaningful work, which is how cybersecurity can be a business enabler through Risk Operations Center. Can we be a business enabler than constantly being the no people and the people beating up to get things done? So today we're going to give a couple examples later in the deck that show two very clear examples of how a CVSS 9.8, which otherwise would have been prioritized to fix by the team, and they had like 70,000 of those. If they had fixed those 70,000 CVEs that were like 9.8, it would have reduced their risk of an attack by exactly 0. Because there was no exploit available, there is no attacker using that, versus they had deprioritized a 6.4 because it was not high up there, but it was actually being actively used as a part of a kill chain. So how do you bring that visibility to operationalize that risk operations center to get a meaningful reduction from that's your attack surface, and this is your risk surface? That's why I opened with saying attack surface management to risk surface management. How do we make that transition and make sure that we're able to show value with what we do in the business? After that, no point if you don't fix it. So as part of a risk operations center, whether you use Qualys or not, you need to patch it. So now how do those 304,000, maybe you already have some tools in place that mitigate some of those vulnerabilities. Maybe you have CrowdStrike policy deployed, maybe you have Cloudflare policy deployed. How do we provide that visibility as a risk operations center to say, yes, I have this horrible exploitable vulnerability, but I do have a protection in place that can block that attack. I'm confident about that, so I don't consider this as a high risk. And so the end of the day, security teams, of course, get emotional about patch management, but we don't care whether it's patched or not. We are more interested in if the risk of the vulnerability being exploited is eliminated or not. And there are many ways to do that. And so, of course, we have been successful with patch management, but we're also releasing a plugin for SCCM and Intune, where you can basically just pull the Qualys findings into SCCM and deploy the patches straight from that. We introduced the concept of mitigation, which is without applying a patch, and I call it patchless patching, which is without applying a patch. If you know exactly how an attacker is going to exploit the particular vulnerability, which obviously our researchers do, then we can make targeted changes to the machine. Maybe you change the permission of the file. Maybe you disable a cipher. Small changes can actually prevent the exploit from happening. So you can mitigate the risk of that vulnerability without applying a patch immediately. Of course, because of your regulators, you might need to do the patch in the next 30 days, but in the first 4 hours or 10 hours of an attacker coming in and creating this, are we able to mitigate the risk of that particular vulnerability? Are we able to, many times, we find we're fixing patching software that's not being used by anybody. Can we get visibility and operationalization of that risk remediation by saying, yes, but the software is not being used by anybody in the last 18 months. I should just uninstall it. That's a pretty legit way of eliminating the risk. If nobody's using it, why are we spending so much time patching it just because it's there? Let's remove that. Sometimes the best way is to isolate. We have regulated environments where people say, if there is exploitable vulnerability, we just want to isolate the device, and that's the way we eliminate the risk of that particular vulnerability. So I call this it's a remediation buffet. So you can eat chicken all day, or chicken salad. You can choose which option works the best for you for reducing the security risk, at the same time reducing the operational risk of the mitigation. So very interesting ways that you can do that, but that really tells you that if you operationalize this process and you're able to show it this way, there is going to be a lot more appreciation for what the security team is doing, rather than a million Jira tickets that we love to create and then nobody likes us anymore. We have the video of the rock.
Today's cybersecurity pros struggle to tie risk mitigation with business objectives due to threats growing in scale and complexity, an overload of top 10 dashboards, and insufficient resources to manage it all effectively. With risks everywhere, from code and applications to cloud, endpoints, and user identities, constantly expanding your attack surface and lacking proper business context, it's nearly impossible to assess their true impact on what matters most to the business. This confusion breeds inefficiencies, making it difficult to prioritize and address the risks that truly count. Sound familiar? While we have security operations centers, SOCs, to detect breaches, what about proactive risk management? It's time to shift our approach. Enter the Risk Operations Center, ROC. The ROC consolidates all critical elements into a seamless and efficient process. It unifies indicators of exposure into a centralized data fabric, consolidating real-time inventory data, and integrating advanced threat intelligence for continuous risk mitigation. By providing business context through cyber risk quantification, the ROC helps organizations identify and prioritize high-risk vulnerabilities, orchestrating actionable remediation strategies to eliminate the most critical threats and reduce uncertainty in risk management. Introducing Qualys Enterprise True Risk Management, ETM, the world's first cloud-based risk operations center. With Qualys ETM, you gain comprehensive visibility into your entire attack surface through a unified asset inventory, aggregating findings across multiple tools and enriching them with insights from over 25 integrated threat feeds. Powered by AI-driven threat prioritization and True Risk Eliminate for immediate remediation, Qualys ETM transforms risk management into a proactive, streamlined process, keeping you ahead of emerging cyber threats. Now is the time to take full control of your risk operations and seamlessly operationalize your risk management strategy. Maximize your cybersecurity investments. Launch your ROC today with Qualys Enterprise True Risk Management, the world's first cloud-based risk operations center.
I'm picturing all of us walking like that as they showed in the video after we implement the ROC. But thank you, marketing team. They were unsure because of the language barrier here in UK if I might be able to deliver the content or not. So they had the backup video made just in case I froze up here on the stage. So ETM, we're going to talk about that all day long. We have absolutely amazing feedback from customers that we are working with. Again, it's a fundamental shift for Qualys. We love our agents and our scanners, but we understand many times that customers are stuck in situations where the CIO team, for absolutely no reason, loves Defender and are pushing down millions and millions of Defender findings down your throat. We're going to help you with ETM. And so we have really made that change in the platform to be able to ingest data from all kinds of different tools. So now, this is one of the reporting that is coming out. I say communication is super important for the success of your risk management program. And this is the reporting that we as Qualys provide our board, obviously not the real data, but the way we do is we map our dollar value business entities and how much they're making every year, which is the value at risk. And we plot the risk score against that same graph. And this is the only graph that the board really now wants to see, because what it tells them is the investment that we're making in cybersecurity is making sure that the highest dollar value risk business entity has the lowest potential risk factors or indicators of exposure, whereas the one that has the lowest dollar value or pound value has actually the highest. And there is a risk appetite. So like I said, you should not go for a zero risk. It's not worth the investment after a certain point. How much risk are you willing to accept? Can you put that in there? And then can you track? So the board sees that majority of the revenue that is being covered has a risk score that is below your risk appetite, which is then after this, they don't really want to know about anything related to the acronym soup or anything like that. They just want to make sure, hey, by the way, that kind of seems high, 850 to 400, that's 80 million, still a little bit high, not comfortable with that. But now with the risk factors that we give you, you can say exactly 5 things need to be fixed for the score to go from 850 to 400. And those 5 things is going to cost us about 325,000 pounds to fix those. Now, what the CFO hears is, if I give you 325,000 pounds, you will reduce the risk of losing $80 million a day by half. She is much more likely to give you that 325, another 25 for T&E, go to Spain, have fun. It's emotional. Nobody's ever talked to a CFO from a cyber team like that. So how do we enable conversations that are not about, here's another dump of Jira tickets? How do we enable conversations that are business-oriented? And the next generation of cyber security professionals are going to be cyber risk professionals. You're not an expert in finding vulnerabilities, or you're not an expert in that. You're really an expert in figuring out which are the cyber issues that truly matter to your business and only fixing on those so you don't end up spending more time and money than is needed to protect your business. Like I said, we have an expanded ecosystem now. It's not just Qualys data. We are already ingesting data from many different tools. We have that working already. There's more actually than that. There's also others that are not necessarily signed up as partners, but we already have data coming from these tools, so you can plug in these tools directly into the platform. I also wanted to introduce the concept of an MROC. So we all know managed SOC, we all know a MDR, but that's more wartime, somebody's in the network, we gotta go get a sniper to figure out who's there. A managed risk operations center is something that a partner, and we have a few partners, we have Tech Collective, we have Texala, who are managed risk operation partners here. They are going to come and help you, because obviously to implement a risk operations center is not something that you can read a dummies book and do it on your own, because you're gonna get stuck at the very first question is, what is my risk quantification? Nobody knows. So partners can provide services like a risk quantification service, which is a key part of MROC. Second service is a risk aggregation service. How do you configure all the different tools to bring data in? Third capability is to be able to monitor risk in real time. So Of course, there are millions and millions of vulnerabilities and findings, but can we use threat intelligence business context where somebody can monitor in real time, because maybe that particular vulnerability was not important for 3 years, and suddenly now there is an exploit, so that has gone high up. How do you weed that out with a monitoring capability so that you know that now this has become important even though it was not in the past? So, and then the last part is they can offer a remediation service to help you fix the things that really matter. So MROC is a key part of that. So as I talked about earlier, essentially at the end of the day, when you look at a risk operations center and how you mitigate risk, there is the risk mitigation, which is the ROC. You have a certain amount of risk that you're going to accept. But one of the things we're very excited about also is we signed up with cyber insurance. This is your risk transfer. And Mulberry, which is a cyber insurance tech company in the US, they went to the US insurance regulator and got approval to give a 15% discount on your cyber insurance premium if the Risk Operations Center ETM score is shared with them. So if they see that you are in a continuously, your score is at an acceptable level, you actually get benefit of that in your cyber insurance premium as well. So, and we are of course working with more companies now for this year to bring out additional partners where you can actually go and say, hey, by the way, deploying a risk operations center is also going to benefit us and the company by enabling the business by giving 15% of the premium that we were spending back to the business. We have some partners here, and you can go check out if you want to have more details on how they can help you. And then that's it. Is that the last slide, Matt? Okay, all right. So I did stay within my time, so thank you very much.